silence. Voilà, la tendance est
Thank you. Hello. Okay. So so my name is Kristina Roney. I am from Washington Lee University, which is in Lexington, Virginia, which is right near Washington, D.C., I guess would be the biggest place, but we're like 3 hours from Washington, D.C. To give you a little introduction about myself, so I am an assistant professor of French at Washington and Lee. I had a prior career in accounting and finance, which is kind of why I have this interdisciplinary approach to my literary analysis. And so today I'm going to talk about sex as investment in Honoré de Balzac's Comédie humaine, des liaisons fructueuses, which means or like profitable relationships. First and foremost, I would like to thank CY Advanced Studies for this opportunity to present and share my research with everyone today. Since all of us here come from different scholarly disciplines, I would like to start with a broad introduction about humanities research, humanities research, then more individually my own approach to research, followed by specific research results from my time here in France. In its broadest terms, research is separated into two branches between science and humanities, both of which are increasingly subject to budgetary constraints from reductions in funding. The most significant issue at hand stems from structural reform of the United States government through the efforts of the Department of Government Efficiency, aka DOGE, which provoked a response from France's President Emmanuel Macron on May 5th, less than 10 days ago. In light of the dramatic cuts to research funding in the United States, Macron designated an additional 100 million euros to a program currently in place called Choose France for Science. While these additional funds are welcome relief for the international scientific community, I would like to underscore the importance of research in the humanities. There has been recent outcry regarding the proposed elimination of the National Endowment for Arts, NEA, but let us not ignore that the National Endowment for the Humanities is also under threat, as is funding for the longstanding Fulbright program, which has provided me with this opportunity to speak with you today. Fulbright scholars are ultimately approved by a presidentially appointed 12-member board. And I would like to read the following citation that highlights the accomplishments and importance of this program as conveyed by the board and the award notification letter that I received last year. The Fulbright program is, I quote, the Fulbright program is devoted to increasing mutual understanding between the people of the United States and the people of other countries. Fulbright is the world's largest and most diverse international educational exchange program. As a Fulbrighter, you will join the ranks of many distinguished program participants. Fulbright alumni have become heads of state, judges, ambassadors, cabinet ministers, CEOs, and university presidents, as well as leading journalists, artists, scientists, and teachers. They include 62 Nobel laureates, 89 Pulitzer Prize winners, 80 MacArthur Fellows, and thousands of leaders across the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. Since its inception in 1946, more than 400,000 Fulbrighters have participated in the program. We might add to this, at the end of my citation, we might add to this impressive description 3 Fulbright alumni who appear in Time magazine's list of the 100 most influential people of 2025. This is significant data that substantiates the tremendously positive impact the program has had not only on U.S. citizens, but on citizens around the world. Reductions to this program therefore impact not only the United States, but the world, in its support of not just international education, but international research and international business in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. I further contend that this documented success demonstrates a highly effective use of government funds. Scientific research has provided us with all of the significant advancements in society today, everything from electricity to computers to the ever-important cell phone. It is at the heart of developments in artificial intelligence currently taking place at breakneck speed. But behind each of these scientific breakthroughs lies the important impact that these innovations have on people's individual lives and on society as a whole. Regulations must be in place to ensure their best service to humanity. Important questions are already being posed about how to ethically regulate and control artificial intelligence to protect society from potential malfeasance. It is thus that scientific research and research in the humanities must develop in tandem. One thing I've learned through curricular design changes at my home institution is how often we as colleagues fail to understand one another's research and its impact across disciplines, which is what renders interdisciplinary research centers like CY Advanced Studies so essential. Scientific research is fairly straightforward, but not without its own challenges, because it produces data-driven results that can be reproduced. Darmid McCulloch of the British Academy explains, and I cite, "Everyone knows what science is, since it gets you to the moon, cures cancer, and brings us nonstick pans. All those are very good things." But he continues boldly that when we try to clarify the difference between our respective academies' scholarly preoccupations, I say that the British Academy, which is the humanities counterpart to the Scientific Royal Society, covers the rest of human wisdom that isn't science, and moreover, that ours is the wise end of human wisdom. In fact, when we try, and that's the end of the quote, sorry. In fact, when we try to define the humanities, it is most often defined by what it is not, science. The National Humanities Center further proclaims that, quote, "Put simply, the humanities help us understand and interpret the human experience as individuals and societies," end of quote. It is hard to argue in today's world against the need to, and I quote, "understand and interpret human experience as individuals and societies." I would even argue that we need this now more than ever, as wars continue to break out around the world, and it is precisely considerations of the human experience that are missing from current efforts to reform governmental structures and funding. In my own research, I situate literature within its historical economic context, studying how the economy impacts culture and how that subsequently influences our reading. Literature exists in a context, and the additional perspectives provided by history, politics, and religion enrich our understanding of the author's meaning and the society he addresses. As economic systems evolve, however, it becomes necessary to interpret historical text for contemporary audiences living in vastly different economic paradigms. Today, capitalism permeates our consciousness. Western society, the US in particular, has become entrenched in a capitalist mindset that can render it difficult to fathom the world any differently. My monographic project, Balzac Society and the Birth of Modern Finance, elucidates the economic changes taking place in France and its impact on society through the lens of Honoré de Balzac's literature, an innovative perspective essential to providing a more comprehensive understanding of this critical time period. This new approach better aligns with the modern perspective of contemporary readers and students of literature, inverting French economist Thomas Piketty's penchant for employing literary reference to illustrate historical economic phenomena. I reference economic history to incorporate literature's role in our understanding of those events. Balzac avows that his literary inspiration was born of a shift he sensed taking place in the world around him, to which he felt compelled to bear witness for future generations. This increasingly resembles our current environment, where we sense significant and profound change underway, but which may be unidentifiable until the gift of time grants perspective. The upheaval he perceived was an economic revolution transforming stores of value from a primarily agricultural to industrial base. It was not until 1850, the year of Balzac's death, that the term industrial revolution was coined. The human comedy memorializes his testimony. I quote, "If the question of money had not been posed," André Wurmser asserts, "there would not have been the human comedy." Wurmser recognizes money's integral role in Honoré de Balzac's monumental cycle of 94 fictional novels and short stories published as a collective. And these were all published between 1829 and 1848. So in about 20 years, he did all of this work. And he's writing with a quill. He didn't have Word. um, the human comedy seeks to portray post-Napoleonic French society at what Balzac perceived to be a crucial moment in history, a moment later identified as the onset of industrialization. Throughout the human comedy, Balzac emphasizes the financial transactions, strategies, and wealth of his characters. Money has not assumed a new role through industrialization, however, nor is it any more despicable or desirable than it had been previously. But it comes under increasing scrutiny once its distribution is no longer fixed and social mobility becomes possible. Previous scholars broach Balzac's critique of monetary society from a Marxist perspective. But my manuscript, Balzac's Society and the Birth of Modern Finance, positions him as an early neoliberal capitalist and proponent of free market economy. Thomas Piketty, author of Capital in the 21st Century, credits Balzac's literature with inspiring his extensive research on global wealth and socioeconomic inequality, noting that societal structure and property distribution remained fixed in the absence of economic growth. Economic growth in France prior to the Industrial Revolution was virtually non-existent, and so too was socioeconomic mobility. Citizens were either blessed or cursed at birth by their inherited social stature. It was not until revolutions disrupted this unrelenting order that monetary distribution came into question. The French Revolution decimated France's political framework, while the Industrial Revolution upended its underlying economic base and thus its social structure. While much focus has been placed on the political turmoil surrounding the human comedy, economic disruption caused by industrialization must not be neglected, for it unleashed unprecedented economic growth that has dominated society with relentless strength ever since. This project extends and leverages the reliability of the human comedy as a gauge of French society during its transition from a traditional agricultural to modern industrial economy. The landmark research of Jean-Hervé Donner in Les réalités économiques et sociales de la Comédie humaine, which was published in 1961, affirms the historical merit of Balzac's socioeconomic portrayal of his contemporary society. Despite the rapid societal evolution taking place due to early industrialization, anachronisms in Balzac's account are only minor. Through 6 selected works, each of 5 chapters traces a different type of financial product. First, credit and the start of a banking system, moving next to bonds and formal marketplace for trading, delving further into real estate and portfolio diversification, which evolved into pure speculation. And finally, though it is not immediately obvious, into sex. Situating this literature within economic history and the Industrial Revolution, I analyze the birth of financial investing and describe a trajectory from tangible agricultural products to increasingly intangible, sensual ones. So this research comes from the final chapter that I'm working on for Balzac's Society and the Birth of Modern Finance, which studies the rise of modern financial markets in France as it transitions from this traditional agricultural to modern industrial economy through the literature of Honoré de Balzac. Up to this point, we've traced the advancement of industrial financial markets from banking and credit to bonds, onto industrial specialization and investment portfolio diversification, before finally progressing into purely speculative products such as newspaper subscriptions and insurance policies. This trajectory demonstrates a clear divergence away from the material nature of an agricultural economy's focus on land as a sole source of investment, and into increasingly nebulous forms of intangible investment commodities. This can further lead to investment in the ultimate, albeit informal, but purely intangible and sensual experience of sex, to be covered in this final chapter. As Dorothy Kelly, I have a quote from her real quick. First, oh, I'll use the arrows. Oh, nothing's going. Okay, the space bar. Okay. So first I have just a couple of pictures that were from a recent exhibit at the Maison de Balzac. And it was on Les Illusions. So one of Balzac's works is called Les Illusions Perdues, which is lost illusions. So this was Les Illusions Conjugales Perdues, so lost conjugal illusions. And one of the, they had a series of different prints which show the l'échelle conjugale, so the conjugal ladder. And so it's kind of trying to traverse the stages of a marital relationship. And so you have kind of the bliss at the beginning of the relationship, followed by at the end, they're clearly no longer blissful. So as Dorothy Kelly so aptly notes in her analysis of La Cousine Bette, when men are unfaithful and pursue their own desires, heedless of their families, sex disconnects from marriage and becomes a commodity that undermines the family's well-being. Although the prior statement refers exclusively to male infidelity, the following gendered approach will reveal the historical events that set such schemes into motion and the motivations behind engagement by each of the two sexes. Interpersonal relationships play a predominant role in Balzac's Comédie humaine, whether it be Cousine Bette's fury towards Adeline Hulot, the scheming revenge of Ferdinand du Tillet against César Birotteau, or the seldom found marital bliss of Derville and his wife Fanny. Balzac painstakingly depicts the relationships that bind these characters together. In his portrayal of society's dynamics and social graces during the first half of the 19th century in France, however, lay three essential pillars necessary to impose order and structure amidst the chaos of daily life. And this was Balzac's true belief, was that the three pillars were the church, the monarchy, and the family. Marriage, as the conjoined leadership of the family unit, therefore, serves as the cornerstone of this institution and is thus subject to Balzac's intense scrutiny. It is a topic to which he continually returns throughout his career. Following his earliest success as an author with Les Chouans en la Bretagne en 1799, published in 1829, he publishes Physiologie du mariage later that same year. Midway through his career, he returns with Le Contrat de mariage in 1835, followed by Mémoires de deux jeunes mariés in 1842, and Petite misère de la vie conjugale in 1846. Although these works address the topic more directly, he takes a subtler approach in numerous other novels and short stories published throughout his illustrious career. It is an ironic focus for a man who never married until the age of 50, which was only about a few months before he died. However, Balzac was not alone in his critique of marriage, as Madame de Staël, Georges Sand, and Stendhal all figure among his most vocal contemporaries. In his personal life, he makes no secret of blaming his sister's death on her mismatched marriage. His youngest sister, Laurence de Monzègle, died only 4 years after her marriage to Armand Désiré de Monzègle, a miserable union Balzac attributes to their unequal social status. Despite his name, Honoré de Balzac, the Balzacs were an upper middle-class family. His father, Bernard François, held 3 positions over the course of his life. He was the administrator of the Hospice Général, deputy mayor of Tours, and lastly served as director of military supplies for the king. It was, in fact, for Laurence's wedding announcements that the author's father adopted the particle de associated with aristocratic families in an effort to veil their social status and avoid scrutiny over her marriage into a noble family. Marriage has long been considered a political and monetary arrangement between families, and Balzac uses fiction as his pulpit to express his own views on the topic. He often depicts both men and women transgressing the bonds of their union as a means of illustrating the dangers and unintended consequences of disharmony within the marital relationship. Indeed, Jean-Hervé Donard confirms that. So I'm going to read them in French, but the English translation is below, and these translations are all my own. Les causes et les conséquences de ce libertinage sont bien connues, et Balzac y fait allusion à plusieurs reprises. Dans la haute société, on se marie rarement par inclination et presque toujours par ambition ou par intérêt. Naturally vulnerable to a desire for love and affection, spouses will look outside of marriage when fulfillment cannot be found from within. These extramarital affairs subsequently resulted in enormous transfers of wealth from family fortunes into the hands of malevolent mistresses and disdainful dandies, which is what I believe constitutes Balzac's primary concern. He was obsessed with family fortunes, whether it involved amassing his own or the dissolution of those belonging to eminent noble families. Retaining aristocratic fortunes was crucial to the stability of social structure and order. Balzac often depicts the strife of romantic relationships, but the preponderance of extramarital affairs throughout his fictional society indicates a particular interest. In Gobseck, which was published in 1830, for example, Anastasie de Restaud's transgressions with Maxime de Trailles proves so strong an impetus to the intrigue that it threatens to overshadow the story of its eponymous character. As mentioned in the first chapter of my book, he vacillated in titling the novella, initially publishing it under Les dangers de l'inconduite, or the dangers of indiscretion, before finalizing its form in the revised Furin edition, which came out in 1844 as Gobseck. In turn, Anastasie's sister, Delphine de Nucingen, quite openly carries on an infamous years-long relationship with Eugène de Rastignac from Le Père Goriot or Old Goriot, before shockingly arranging for her daughter and only child, Augusta, to marry him. In Le Père Goriot alone, the reader catches a glimpse of the affairs taking place between Anastasie and Maxime, Delphine and Eugène, Claire de Beauséant and Miguel d'Adjuda Pinto, and Antoinette de Langeais and Armand de Montriveau, giving the impression that not a single marital bond remains sacred among the weakened morals of this early 19th century Parisian society. Money and power decide marital alliances. Tragically, Goriot, a grain merchant by trade, devotes his entire career to amassing a fortune large enough to provide generous dowries for each of his two daughters. He anticipates that social ascent through these quote-unquote good marriages will secure their happiness and ensure a life of leisure. Anastasie gains entry into the aristocracy by marrying the Comte de Restaud, eldest son of an old and well-respected noble family, while Delphine harnesses her future to the rapid rise of a great financier, Frédéric de Nucingen. Though noble titles once circulated only through birthright, these marriages contracted during the Napoleonic era signaled the rising power of money in a faltering caste-based society. Once the Restoration places power back into the hands of the monarchy, thus restoring the prestige of some of the monetary privilege accorded to the aristocracy, conventions of respectability discredit these marriages of convenience contracted during a prior period of economic duress. Despite the successful ascent of the Goriot daughters from the bourgeoisie into the nobility, they retain their stature as Goriots in the eyes of the gentrified aristocracy. When Rastignac is immediately smitten by his first encounter with Delphine at the opera, his cousin and companion, the Vicomtesse de Beauséant, remarks how the Goriot penetrates her every movement, thus underscoring the hereditary nature of noble grace. And when Camille de Grandlieu reveals an affinity for Ernest de Restaud, lost my place here. In Gobseck, her mother forewarns, Monsieur de Restaud a une mère, in reference to Anastasie, qui mangerait des millions, une femme mal née, une demoiselle Goriot, qui jadis a fait beaucoup parler d'elle. Children seemingly cannot escape the sins of their parents. Goriot attributes his own demise to the misery of his daughter's marriages and absence of the fairy tale ending he had envisioned. The Vicomtesse de Grandlieu blatantly exposes her priorities when considering a future spouse for Camille. She acknowledges Camille's expressed interest in Ernest, but explains Monsieur Ernest doit être bien riche pour faire accepter sa mère par une famille comme la nôtre. Songez que mon fils sera quelques jours duc de Grandlieu. Il réunira la fortune des deux maisons de Grandlieu. Je lui veux un beau-frère à son goût. The preponderant patriarchal values of the society favor the needs of Camille's brother over her own in her marital arrangements. Camille's uncle, the Comte de Born, interjects in defense of the young man by noting the beauty and prestige of the Resto family coat of arms. He reassures his sister, c'est un très vieux blason. It's a very old crest. Not once do they contemplate the young man's character, nor their compatibility as a couple. Although the union would be Camille's, her future spouse will reflect on the entire family, and clearly wealth, influence, and prestige reign supreme in marital provisions, taking precedence over any affairs of the heart. In light of the monetary and political attributes that determine marital unions among the aristocracy, it should come as no surprise that spouses might seek fulfillment of their physical and emotional needs from outside sources. More often than not, knowledge of these relationships circulates untethered in public and without detriment to their social reputations, so long as they are conducted discreetly. As a result of Madame de Beauséant's relationship with Monsieur d'Ajuda-Pinto, no one calls on her in the afternoon between 2 and 4 o'clock. She may even dine at home with her lover and her husband, who afterwards would accompany them to the opera, only to excuse himself once they are seated. This presumably allows him to rejoin his own mistress elsewhere. Despite public knowledge of her affair, she prevails over society during the 1819 to 1820 setting of Le Père Goriot. Likewise, in Splendeur et Misère des Courtisanes, which translates to a harlot high and low, Diane de Maufrigneuse holds no resentment against her friend Léontine de Cergy when she takes Lucien de Rubempré from her as a lover. And the two ladies further join forces to clear his name when he is arrested as a murder suspect in the death of Esther van Gomsec. Monsieur de Cergy loves his wife, despite her betrayal, and only rebukes her panicked reaction to Lucien's imprisonment and subsequent death, cautioning her to exercise more discretion and demanding secrecy from those judicial forces who bear witness to her outbursts and emotional despair. Marriage arrangements held no monopoly on the transactional nature of coupling, nor the marital exchange of goods. Material exchange of goods. Courtesans and prostitutes present the most obvious example. Kelly has gone so far as to say that one of the most important effects of this text, in reference to La Cousine Bette, is to show not only how money is connected to love and sexuality, but also how marriage, even though it has traditionally been linked to money, is essentially traffic in women, like prostitution. And in this text, it is sometimes linked with prostitution. Kelly's tie between marriage and prostitution in La Cousine Bette, in fact, references extramarital affairs because of the exchange of monetary value within these relationships. While she boldly ties these liaisons to prostitution, we will continue to refer to them as extramarital affairs, given the asymmetrical nature of the information and motivation shared between the two lovers. This chapter thus delves into profiteering from extramarital affairs as an informal, albeit non-traditional, investment strategy, conducted by both men and women, as always through the financial lens of Honoré de Balzac, by focusing on two of his most prolific lovers, Valérie Marneff from La Cousine Bette, and Maxime de Trailles, who reappears prolifically across the Comédie humaine, but whose story I will not address today for sake of time. At the quote-unquote heart of marriage, prostitution, and courtesan relations, nevertheless, both parties acknowledge the transactional origin of this quote-unquote engagement. Although I have alluded to issues related to marriage and the potential escapism provided by courtesans and prostitutes, this chapter focuses primarily on sex as an investment strategy conducted through extramarital relations, the extraction of monetary value from lovers. It will confirm the deliberate financial motives of those who engage in such strategies, and explain why both men and women might be driven to take such measures. But again, today we're only focusing on the female side of it. Relationships involving marriage, courtesans, and prostitutes are established by both formal and informal contracts with symmetrical information shared by both parties, while exploitative extramarital affairs are built upon lies. They are more subversive, since only the quote-unquote investor is aware of the lover's classification as quote-unquote investment. The one-sided nature of this transaction thus renders the naive party even more vulnerable through their ignorance to the existence of any such quote-unquote contract. In a poignant quote from La Femme de 30 ans, Julie d'Aiglemont exclaims, "Nous sommes, nous femmes, plus maltraités par la civilisation que nous ne le serions par la nature. Eh bien, le mariage tel qu'il se pratique aujourd'hui me semble être une prostitution légale." Valérie Marneff, for her part, seemingly embodies the duality of this role as both wife and prostitute. The author introduces Valérie as a bourgeois wife, une femme comme il faut, and neighbor to the novel's eponymous character. La Cousine Bette is a complex story about the scheming jealousy of one cousin, Lisbeth Fischer, or Bette, against another, Adeline Hulot d'Ervy, and how she seeks her revenge through the utter destruction of their family. As one half of the diptych collection, Les Parents Pauvres, Bette is the poor relative living within the family circle of the wealthy Hulot d'Ervy. In Balzac's typical diametric fashion, Bette is everything Adeline is not: poor, old, unmarried, and ugly. She is the incarnation of her name, Bette, and all the derivations of that definition: a brute, a beast, foolish, and stupid. Her best strategy is to exploit Adeline's weakness, her philandering husband, Hector, whose penchant for women renders him an easy target. Enter Valérie Marneff, with whom Bette joins an alliance. She is presented as a beautiful woman, confident in her sexual allure, yet living in Bette's same squalid building, and married to a heinous husband, Marneff, whose countenance is described as un homme traduit aux assises pour attentat aux mœurs, a man on trial for moral indecency. The couple's interaction as husband and wife only reinforces this ghastly image when he questions, "Tu as fait, mon directeur? Did you play, my manager?" Followed by her unflinching affirmative response as she exits the apartment to likewise resolve their overdue rent. They are in financial peril and have exhausted all resources for credit. The pair thus scheme for Valérie to seduce Hulot, to whom Marneff reports. So Hulot is her husband's boss, to garner him a promotion at work and perhaps even bestowal of the cross of the Légion d'honneur. Why not? To her husband, Valérie stages the affair as a sacrifice designed to relieve their economic hardship. Joining forces with Bette in her jealous rage, however, the two women aim much higher. They strike a ruthless pact to tirons du râtelier le plus de foin possible, to reap as much hay as possible, in a plot to decimate the Hulot family. The intent to leverage Valérie's sexual appeal for material profit is established from the very beginning. As Marie-Henriette Failly is quick to point out in her book La femme et le code civil dans la comédie humaine d'Honoré de Balzac, however, les rédacteurs du code ont assimilé la femme mariée aux mineurs et aux interdits, auxquels il serait dangereux d'accorder une voix dans les décisions prises à leur sujet. While Valérie has obtained her husband's approval, and even more shockingly, his cooperation, by promising him his own recompense, any material acquisition she might procure would, by default, belong to her husband, due to her classification as a minor in the eyes of the law. This also impedes her from owning property or negotiating contracts. Failly further specifies that women have no individual control even over their own personal possessions. En effet, toute opération commerciale conduite par une femme mariée, même si cette opération touchait à ses biens personnels, devait avoir recueilli l'assentiment écrit de son mari. Although married women retain independent ownership of their dowries after they marry, or after they have wed, they may not dispose of any of these assets without their husband's explicit consent. It is for this same reason that Derville reproaches Gobseck when Anastasie de Restaud negotiates a loan against her diamond necklace to cover debts contracted by Maxime de Trailles and Gobseck. While marriage should hamper Valerie's entrepreneurial spirit, she resolves this obstacle by convincing her husband to grant her a legal separation of assets. At the time of this agreement, it grants Valérie sole ownership of their current residence, an apartment she received lavishly furnished and decorated as a gift from Hulot. So she's already left her decrepit apartment building. Now she has a very luxurious apartment, as well as any future property. This arrangement provides her with the necessary privacy to secretly build her fortune through gifts she extracts from her lovers and to hide those lovers from her husband, but also from each other. Valérie's seduction begins with Hulot, but once she garners his attention, her transgressions multiply at a seemingly exponential rate. At the height of her success, she juggles 5 potential fathers for her unplanned yet fortuitous pregnancy, which she leverages to reap yet even more financial support from her lovers. The reader, meanwhile, privy to her antics, questions the existence of any pregnancy at all, despite affirmations given to her closest confidant, Bette. And in the end, she loses the pregnancy, so we'll never actually know if she was truly pregnant or not. Nevertheless, her and Bette's plans are to strip away as much wealth as possible. And so Valérie carefully extracts gifts and promises from each lover, while her legitimate husband's deteriorating health leaves her anxiously awaiting liberation. The only exception among her lovers is Wenceslas Steinbach. His trade as an artist holds no promise of fortune, but fits into Bette's plans for revenge on Hortense for having stolen him from her grip. So in fact, Wenceslas is her niece's husband, but he also used to live in her decrepit building, and she was kind of secretly in love with him. So then when Hortense married him, she felt like Hortense stole him from her. But Bette is an old maid. I mean, she was too old for any of that anyway. So it fits into her plot for revenge. Marneffe, for his part, stands undisturbed by the scandal that has befallen his wife and views the pending birth as beneficial to his career. He assumes the child must belong to his director, Hulot. In addressing Valérie, he states, J'espère que Monsieur le Baron Hulot aura soin de son fils et qu'il n'en chargera pas un pauvre employé. Je compte me montrer très exigeant avec lui. Aussi, prenez vos sûretés, madame. Tâchez d'avoir de lui des lettres où il vous parle de son bonheur, car il se fait un peu trop tirer l'oreille pour ma nomination. Their marriage is so corrupt that he never once questions his biological claims on the child. He receives news of the impending birth with joy, not for the child, but for the promotion. He advises Valérie to obtain proof of acknowledgement from Hulot in case Hulot should balk at his demands. He condones his wife's blatant infidelity for the sole desire of a promotion, though he believes Hulot to be her only lover, completely unaware that she has 3 more, all of whom unabashedly socialize with him inside their home. Valérie's intention to leverage her fortuitous pregnancy to obtain everything she desires, including rente, which is like investment income. It's usually interest income from bonds. In fact, especially rente. She intertwines the announcement of her pregnancy to Hulot with the advantages she intends to procure. Mon vieux grognard, lui dit-elle, il était bien difficile de ne pas faire nommer ton éditeur responsable, notre gérant, si tu veux, chef de bureau et officier de la Légion d'honneur. Car tu l'as ruiné, cet homme. Il adore son Stanislas, ce petit monstrico qui tient de lui et que je ne puis souffrir. À moins que tu ne préfères donner une rente de 1200 francs à Stanislas, en nue propriété, bien entendu, l'usufruit en mon nom. Leaving him no time to process the pregnancy announcement, she asserts Hulot either promote her husband and nominate him for the Légion d'honneur, or provide her legitimate child 1,200 francs in rente. So these are annual interest payments. Further stipulating that she received the benefit of the income, since the interest rate on bonds was generally about 5%. 1,200 francs in rente would require a principal investment of approximately 24,000 francs, taken in her son's name, with income allocated directly to her for some fixed period of time. Her legitimate son merely serves as a distraction, so that Hulot will insist that the investment be in the name of her pending child, to whom he's the father, which he believes to be his. In doing so, he inadvertently commits to both her requests, knowing that he still must appease her husband. Valérie tweaks her approach with Crevel, and she manages to procure plenty of money from him without ever directly asking for it. In fact, the two are in some ways better suited for one another, since they both view life through a financial lens. Valérie's relationship with Crevel differs from Hulot's. Valérie initially sought out Hulot as Marneffe's director to resolve her family's crumbling financial situation. Balzac insists on the importance of luxury to her Creole nature, ever inclined towards leisure. Her husband approves because of his vested interest in a promotion. Crevel, on the other hand, pursues Valérie himself, and armed with the knowledge of her affair with Hulot, Valérie thus replaces Adeline in his own plot for revenge on Hulot for having stolen Josepha. So Adeline is Hulot's wife, and at one point, Hulot and Crevel have been friends, and they used to frequent each other because they both had these lovers. And Hulot stole Josepha, who's a courtesan, from Crevel. And so Crevel has been seeking revenge against Hulot. And towards the beginning at the very beginning of the book, he's trying to convince Hulot's wife to sleep with him, but she is a very respectable woman and she's very religious and devout, and so she turns him down. So now he's decided Hulot is in love with Valérie, so he wants to steal Valérie to then get his revenge. So Valérie thus replaces Adeline in his own plot for revenge on Hulot for having stolen Josepha, though she no longer belongs to either of them. He arranges 6,000 francs in rente for Valérie in exchange for le droit de prendre aussi souvent qu'il pourrait sa revanche de l'enlèvement de Josepha. In other words, to be able to sleep with her whenever he wants. At 5% interest, this requires a principal investment of 120,000 francs. Their affair is a negotiated arrangement from the start and kept secret from all but Bette, who serves as a universal confidant and privy to everyone's secrets. In light of her marital status, Valérie insists that Crevel issue the rente in her maiden name, Valérie Portin, épouse séparée de biens du sieur Marneffe. So this is where she has already successfully separated her assets, and now she's accumulating this wealth separate and of her own, so that her husband has no knowledge of it and has no rights to it. The underlying contractual dynamic of their relationship, nevertheless, forces Valérie into a position subservient to Crevel. Valérie assumes her sexual prowess and asserts it over men, married and single alike, juggling her lovers in search of the best outcome for herself, as would a courtesan or prostitute. Indeed, Marneffe serves as accomplice in her affair with Hulot, but Bette is her true accomplice. And her jealous rage proves even more salacious than that of a corrupt husband. Hulot, upon learning of her affair with Crevel, accuses her of possessing a moral decrepitude that surpasses even a prostitute's. Because Josepha Génicadine, that was the other girlfriend, I don't know, you'd call girlfriend, mistress, Josepha Génicadine était dans leur droit en nous trompant. Elles font métier de leur charme, elles. Despite her external pious demeanor, her private conduct transcends blasphemy. Balzac deliberately doubles the courtesan lifestyle in contrast to Valérie's to underscore their resemblance. Although not considered a courtesan in the strict sense of the term, she exudes a similar vile greed and exercises equally unscrupulous behavior. She is une femme comme il faut, a properly married bourgeois woman who fiercely projects the persona of a devout patron of the church. It is important to note that society at this time divides women into three categories, listed here in hierarchical order. First, they're the femme comme il faut, like Valérie. These entail spouses and young women of marital quality. Next come the femmes comme il en faut, like Josepha and Jenny Cadine, who are women in precarious social positions in need of protectors. They are actresses, dressmakers, flower merchants, and also prostitutes. Lastly are the undesirables. Those condemned for their inability to incite passion due to age or haggard bodies worn out by manual labor. A category that includes widows, female doorkeepers, and those who care for the sick, or have just never married like that. But Balzac cautions that une femme comme il faut is more dangerous than une femme comme il en faut, because she often has her husband for accomplice. Mais la doucereuse honnêteté, mais les semblants de vertu, mais les façons hypocrites d'une femme mariée qui ne laisse jamais voir que les besoins vulgaires d'un ménage et qui se refuse en apparence aux folies, entraînent à des ruines sans éclat et qui sont d'autant plus singulières qu'on les excuse en ne se les expliquant point. Furthermore, une femme comme il faut conducts her affairs through deceit, while the femme comme il en faut openly conducts theirs as a calculated business. Hulot, Keller, and Descrignon recognize that Josepha's affection can only be bought, and that the Duc d'Hérouville's fortune far surpasses their own. They therefore must concede. The Duke stakes his claim on Josepha by his public bestowal of gifts, and their importance signal his long-term interest and protection. The Duke obviously has his own legitimate wife and family, but then he very publicly lays claim to Josepha, so that it's sort of a marital relationship, if you will, but without the legitimacy or anything else. Unlike courtesans who publicly tout their exploits, a married woman runs a much greater risk. She must ensnare her prey through the illusion of genuine emotion, so that the lover cares enough for her well-being to remain discreet and never slander her delicate reputation. The clandestine nature of her attachment renders it even more enticing to her lovers, while leaving her in a position of greater vulnerability. As she explains to Covell when he seeks to unveil their relationship to Hulot, because what would be revenge if he didn't know he was doing it, right? Oh, wait. Oh, I'm going just a second. Sorry, I lost. No, sorry. Sorry. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. So she says, so as she explained to Covell, when he seeks to unveil the relationship to Hulot as the tour de force of his revenge, cette femme, referring to herself, ne vaut pas Josepha. Cette demoiselle, now she's talking about Josepha, a le courage de son infamie, tandis que moi, je suis une hypocrite qui devrait être fouettée en place publique. Hélas, Josepha se protège par son talent et par sa fortune. Mon seul rempart à moi, c'est mon honnêteté. Je suis encore une digne et vertueuse bourgeoise. Mais si vous faites un éclat, que deviendrai-je? So despite juggling 4 lovers simultaneously, while still married to her legitimate husband, she continues to assert herself as dignified and virtuous. It is a public persona she must maintain to uphold her respectability and the honor of her entire family in the eyes of society. As a panel at the recent exhibit Illusion conjugale perdue that took place in the Maison de Balzac explains, si l'honneur d'une femme tient à sa vertu, celui de l'homme dépend de la fidélité de son épouse. Et le thème du mari trompé traverse tout le 19e siècle comme un immense éclat de rire. It is equally clear that Marneffe's naivety toward the true extent of Valerie's infidelity is meant as ridicule. Yet he seems to merit his own contempt for having essentially prostituted his wife to his director in the first place. Balzac further elaborates on Valérie's double life. En présence du monde, Elle offrait la réunion enchanteresse de la candeur pudique et rêveuse, de la décence irréprochable et de l'esprit rehaussé par la gentillesse, par la grâce, par les manières de la créole. Mais dans la tête-à-tête, elle dépassait les courtisanes. Elle y était drôle, amusante, fertile en inventions nouvelles. Once again, the dangers she presents and the depravity of her situation are depicted as worse than a prostitute because of its clandestine nature. Interminably driven by her material interest, Valérie nevertheless proposes to Crevel that he must provide her with sufficient income to compensate for the social position she would lose should he insist on flouting their relationship to Hulot. And that level of consideration starts at 50,000 francs, mind you. Her strongest weapon, therefore, is love. She must disarm her lovers through love so that they care enough to be vested in her dignity and honor that, like everything else, she would willingly sacrifice should she find the terms agreeable. Valérie so thoroughly ensnares Crevel that he later bargains to marry her following the death of her husband, initially offering 8,000 francs in rente, mais viagère, with release of the corpus investment following 5 years of constancy. So even he is not sure she'll be faithful to him should they marry. So he's requiring 5 years of faithfulness and constancy. The term viagère indicates the payments to be a lifetime annuity. In other words, she would receive a regular annual stipend for the duration of her life. Consistent with Alexandre Perrault's theory involving loans versus gifts, Valérie reproaches Crevel's incessant bargaining. Toujours des marchés. Les bourgeois n'apprendront jamais à donner. Voulez-vous faire des relais d'amour dans la vie avec des inscriptions de rente? According to Perrault, monetary gifts distinguish the aristocracy from the bourgeoisie, who only ever offer loans. His marital proposition thus underscores his bourgeois nature, in contrast to the generosity of the Duc d'Hérouville, who, in addition to his lavishness with Josepha, also shows compassion towards Hulot and loans him money in his time of need. Josepha, however, clarifies the term of this loan when informing him of the Duke's arrangements. Of the Duke's generosity. Le Duc fait bien des choses. Il te prête, c'est-à-dire il te donne 10 000 francs, et il en met 8 chez son notaire qui sera chargé de te compter 600 francs tous les trimestres. Loans from nobles constitute gifts. Only the bourgeois insist on repayment. Valérie's complaints only push Crevel to up his ante with an immediate recompense of 10,000 francs in rente and the promise of a small hotel, furnishings included, in exchange for her hand in her widowhood. In addition, he will grant her half of the 300,000. Sorry, it moved on me. I'm not sure which direction these arrows go. Okay. Half of the 300,000 franc profit he has generated outside of his fortune as a stipulation in their marriage contract. Unlike his initial proposition to Adeline, whose religious faith guides all her decisions, his bargaining proves effective with Valérie, whose motives are purely material. In the end, Valérie has risen far beyond her dismal apartment in the indigent neighborhood where both she and Bette began the novel. She has amassed an independent fortune through manipulation of her husband and 4 lovers before marrying Crevel. She has moved from her miserable apartment to a more luxurious one supplied by Hulot before finishing her days in a mansion with Crevel. Seemingly no one escapes karma, however. Shortly following her second marriage, Valérie falls victim to a plot of revenge initiated by Hulot's son, who is also Crevel's son-in-law. So when Hulot and Crevel were hanging out together with their mistresses, they married their children. So Hulot's son married Crevel's daughter. After he deliberately exposes Valérie's infidelity to her Brazilian lover, Montes Motejanos, and ignites his jealous rage, Valérie dies an excruciating death infected by an unknown tropical disease that eats her flesh, attacking the very source of her power, her beauty. Bette, for her part, succumbs to tuberculosis. The death of Balzacian characters always aligns with their dominant character trait or with their passion. But the brutal deaths of these two women, Michael Lucy suggests, reinforces hints throughout the novel that their relationship extends beyond friendship and into more romantic spheres. While their romantic involvement has never been definitively determined, and I will not address it here, Balzac depicts several same-sex relationships across the Comédie humaine, and Lucy asserts in reference to La Cousine Bette that Balzac will reserve a particularly sensational and mostly gratuitous violence for the end of the female couple, thereby furthering the kind of masculinist dissymmetry already apparent in his treatment of couples of women and couples of men a decade earlier. In Balzac's world, violent deaths are the fate of female couples, and so the particularly gruesome fate for both Valérie and Bette seemingly reinforces this image. So in fact, Valérie potentially had her husband, 4 lovers, and Bette as we go through this. And I will note that Honoré de Balzac was one of the earliest French authors to depict same-sex relationships, at least in mainstream literature. I mean, there were references as early, like Brantôme used to write about lesbianism and stuff, but it wasn't considered, and that was back in the 16th century in the Renaissance period, but that wasn't considered mainstream literature. So he is actually able to, despite all of the censorship taking place during the 19th century, he is able to depict these same-sex relationships very subtly throughout. For example, Vautrin is hitting on Rastignac throughout Le Père Goriot. Balzac appears to intentionally intermingle the various societies that coexist in Paris. The frequent references across his work that assimilate marriage with prostitution call into question the difference between the two. Once Valérie has been forced to sleep with the repulsive Marneffe, the existence of their son Stanislas confirms that the marriage was indeed consummated. It was never a mariage blanc. How much worse can it be sleeping with 2 elderly men like Hulot and Crevel? Her husband pushes her towards Hulot for his own benefit. She desires none of them, although she expresses longing for her 2 young lovers, Montejanos, the Brazilian, and Steinbock, who's married to Bette's niece. In Physiologie de mariage, Balzac forewarns, ne commencez jamais le mariage par un viol. Never begin your marriage with rape. Later followed by, le sort d'un ménage dépend de la première nuit. The success of your household is determined by the first night. The mere fact that he states it confirms its common practice. Valérie's circumstances would be tragic, if not so common. Titu Lecoq notes that what we consider marital rape today was simply le devoir conjugal. It was conjugal responsibility at the time, and that cette présomption de consentement n'a disparu qu'en 2006, avec un texte précisant qu'il y a viol lorsqu'un rapport sexuel est imposé, quelle que soit la nature des relations existantes entre l'agresseur et sa victime, y compris s'ils sont unis par les liens du mariage. These are the same laws being challenged once again today in light of the trial of Dominique Pellicot this past year in Avignon, France. And so she empowers herself through her sexuality, the only asset over which she has any control. The circumstances that led her to this conclusion are tragic, but the power she exercises in taking control over her situation in an effort to emancipate herself from her dependence on men is somewhat admirable. Hulot, on the other hand, stands in contrast to Valérie. He is the embodiment of what we would refer to today as a sex addict, because he is just going on and on. He always has a woman, and they're getting younger. His victims are getting younger as you go through the text. So he's what we would refer to today as a sex addict, adding perhaps the title of pedophile given the age of some of his victims recounted in the story. His sexual activity is even more extreme than Valérie's, and yet he receives no reprobation. He has killed his wife because she's died of misery. He's killed his brother because he stole from the state, and his brother was working for the government and so committed suicide in shame, and he was too cowardly to do so, Hulot was. So he's killed his wife, he's killed his brother, he's bankrupted his family, and yet he persists through life dodging any consequences. as he flees to the countryside with one of the family's servants, who he christens Baron through their Baroness through their marriage. In the end, why should Valerie's activity render her life any different than Hulot's? This is not the conclusion that I think Balzac meant to advocate, but it does come to light. While my research is still in the developmental stages, especially on the male side of the exploitive extramarital affairs, women are driven in desperation by their limited rights in the eyes of the law, both civilian and marital. Thank you. Thank you very much.